Hello, football fans. Welcome to the Believe NFL Draft Special on Bally's, Ohio. Lindsay Rhodes and Solomon Wilcots from the Believe Fantasy Football Show and Believe in Bengals Show, respectively, taking a look at the draft, which is just days away now. Solly, it's almost here, finally.
Yeah, Lens, look, we're excited about it. Whether you're a Cincinnati Bengals fan or a Cleveland Browns fan, this is the show to watch because we get to have some fun with this. These two teams are hotly contested, but teams are, they stand down on draft day. They actually work together. You can see trades happening, taking place, right? Teams moving up or down the board, given what player you may want to give up. I don't think we'll see Bengals and Browns doing any deals. However, everyone's standing down. We're all friends here, right?
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. We're gonna talk about the Bengals and the Browns and their two draft approaches very specifically, very different. I mean, they're different in terms of the amount of capital with which they have to approach this draft. We're starting with the Bengals, who have the 9th most draft capital, according to Tankathon. They've got a ton of picks. We're looking at 18, 49, 2 other day 2 picks, 3 picks in the 100 range, 3 in the 200 range. Before we get to their draft approach and the guys that they might want to take, there is this other situation that could impact their draft, and that is the Tee Higgins contract status. Will they trade him? Will they not trade him? He's on the tag. He has said that he's anticipating playing in Cincinnati next year. Are you anticipating that as well?
I really am. I'm anticipating that Tee Higgins will be playing for the Cincinnati Bengals during the upcoming 2024 season. Now, if someone calls up Duke Tobin, calls the Cincinnati Bengals, and bowls them over with an offer, then there's no doubt they're listening. But I think they intend to keep Tee Higgins, to keep the wide receiving core intact, who has such great chemistry with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. He really does fit in that locker room very well. The Bengals are very intentional about who they're willing to bring into that locker room. So someone's going to have to pretty much bowl them over by giving up a king's ransom to pry Tee Higgins away from the Cincinnati
What do you think
Bengals.
would constitute a king's ransom in this case? Like, what would get it done?
Uh, Well, first round pick. Typically, you're not probably going to get that. Remember, he was taken in the 2020 draft with the first pick in the second round. So on day 2, he was the guy that heard his name called first. I think they would want a starter. Say if they took a second round pick, they would want someone who can come in and start for this football team right away in an area where they have a need. So they're not beyond. I think the last time they made this kind of trade, it was Billy Price, who had been a first-round pick for the Cincinnati Bengals in 2018, and just prior to the 2021 season, they traded center Billy Price to the New York Giants for B.J. Hill, and almost unanimously, everyone within the Bengals organization felt like they won that swap, and they felt really good about bringing over B.J. Hill, who ended up getting a new contract at the end of the 2021 season.
All right, so a trade involving T, you think maybe unlikely on draft day. What about a different kind of trade? What about a trade out of the 18th pick, either up or down? Is this a team that you see working the board with that pick? What's the best approach strategically, in your opinion?
They really don't normally do that. You don't see them trading up or down and doing like a piano and trying to acquire more picks. They already have 10 total draft picks, so they don't need more currency. In fact, they've got 3 picks in the third round. As you well know, you want to get as many picks in the top 100 selections as you can possibly get. Right now, they have 5. So I don't even know that they would be looking to move up to get. If they didn't have a second, maybe moving down to acquire a second round pick, that would be maybe in the cards. But where they're sitting right now, when you consider the fact that they already have a quarterback lens, teams are going to be moving up the board to try to get some of the talented quarterbacks in the 2024 draft. What does that mean? Other players of need outside of the quarterback position are going to fall to them at 18. They're going to get pretty much really good interior defensive linemen at 18. They're going to have an option to maybe get a really good offensive lineman with the 18th overall pick. Now, if they covet maybe one of those players, and only they know, right? Which guy they really, truly love more than maybe the others. And if they feel there's great disparity between the guy they would prioritize as opposed to the next guy at that same position, then I think that's always for any team to say, hey, maybe we want to consider going up to get our guy as long as we're not having to give up too much. So I don't see them doing that, but yet I'm not taking it
Yeah,
off
I
the
think
table.
that your point about the quarterbacks at the top of the draft is a really smart one, in terms of the value that it creates further down the board for other people that aren't in the quarterback market. I would also say the same thing for wide receivers. If you're looking those top 3 wide receivers, I mean, they're going to go, right?
Mhm.
Like, and so if you're not a team
That's
that
right.
needs that, it's going to push. Or if you're drafting in the second half of the draft, as the Bengals are at 18, then you could have like some of the top defensive guys, or the players at other position groups are going to go much
Yeah.
later in the first round than they would in a different year. So who's your target at 18? If you're staying put, best case, realistic scenario, who do you want?
Mhm. Well, it's a sort of a the Bengals did such a good job, Lens, during free agency, really filling all of their needs. So it gives them great flexibility with what they could do at 18. And so now they're pretty much drafting for what? Depth. They're not really even drafting for a starter. Of course, if you take someone 18th overall, he's a first round pick. You would like for him to be a day one starter if you needed him, but they won't be pressed into a situation where they would have to do it. For instance, with those players at certain positions that we talked about that could fall, how about a quality defensive tackle? I think one of the best on the board could be there. I think a cornerback. Think cornerback, right? One of the best on the board when they go on the clock with the 18th overall selection. I don't know that they would do this. Would you draft a player that maybe you feel you would need
Yeah.
next year, considering they're so high up? If Joe Burrow is going to keep this team on the winning track, that means they're normally going to be drafting much lower than 18th, right around the low 20s, or excuse me, high 20s, low 30s. So would you draft Tee Higgins' replacement this year? If it was someone like Brian Robinson Jr., for instance, would you go ahead and do that? I think all of those things are on the table. Would you take the tight end Brock Bowers at 18, even though you don't feel like you need a tight end? We all know Brock Bowers is more than just a tight end. He's so explosive. He's a touchdown producing player. He can supplement the 2 wide receivers that you have in Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins. And if you lost Tee Higgins to free agency at the end of 2024, you already have your maybe secondary weapon on the offense in Brock Bowers. So those are the multiple ways in which the Cincinnati Bengals find themselves in, having done such a good job in
I've
free
heard people
agency.
say, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah who said if Brock Bowers ends up in Cincinnati, they're throwing a party. They're in the Bengals
That's
at
right.
their draft party. A good fit
Yeah.
obviously makes them really
Mhm.
explosive next year with all of those offensive
Mhm.
weapons, but he might not be there at 18. So in the event that
Mhm.
he is not an option for the Bengals, what do they do then? We'll throw out some specific names in terms of maybe a potential plan B that's coming up next. Welcome back. Lindsay Rhodes and Solomon Wilcots here discussing the Bengals draft approach, and we're going to get to the Browns in just a bit. But before the break, Solly identified Brock Bowers as a guy that might be on the wish list of the Cincinnati Bengals front office. There is a chance, Solly. I think it's a pretty good chance that he's not available when the Bengals pick at 18. The Jets in 10, in particular, are a team that I see connected to him a lot. So if you have to pivot off of that, I know you mentioned defensive tackle, cornerback, maybe O-line is some other position groups that they might be interested in targeting at 18. Where do you start?
Well, the offensive line is an issue that Cincinnati Bengals. It's always been a point of conversation in Cincinnati since Joe Burrow arrived. And as you well know, protecting him is priority number one. Keeping him safe and on the field, and his availability is so important to this football team. So I could see them wanting to add depth to this offensive line. I think they're very strong and secure in terms of their starting five after signing Trent Brown at the right tackle position. Jonah Williams had played that position last year after moving over from left tackle to right. He now is in Arizona, having defected via free agency. Look, if J.C. Latham were still there when the Cincinnati Bengals went on the clock, I think that'd be great. I think the Bengals would love that. You just don't know because there's a cluster of really talented offensive linemen, and you don't know what the teams ahead of them are going to do. We know there's going to be a run on these offensive linemen. You just don't know who likes who. It's kind of like dating, right? The girl may like one guy, but guess what? That guy might not be the one for her. So guess what? She's got to choose someone else. Maybe that another team and that team has already taken that player. So it's going to be really like speed dating a little bit in that first round, at least in the upper 15. That's how the offensive linemen are going to go that quick. I think if there's an interior defensive tackle that's there, like a Byron
Mhm.
Murphy, because I do think the best defensive tackle in the draft could still be available when the Bengals go on the clock. Think about it. They have the 18th overall pick. They would love to be able to not necessarily replace DJ Reader because they did sign Sheldon Rankins in free agency. But if they could add to that with the best defensive tackle on the board, knowing that you're only picking 18th and he's still there, I think they would be dancing in the street if that scenario were to
Yeah,
occur as
the
well.
O-line thing, to your point there, I think it's definitely the draft in general is an exercise in beauty, is in
Yes,
the eye of the beholder. So it just depends on how
exactly.
different front offices will view these guys. But with the offensive tackles, it feels very obvious that it's going to be like, well, and maybe it won't be, but it feels like it's Joe Alt, and then there's a cluster
Yeah,
of guys, and it'll just be
everybody
like,
else. Yeah.
which of these asterisks that are attached to each one is the one that you're concerned with or the one that you're least concerned
Hmm.
with, and they all kind of have different strengths
Yeah,
and weaknesses and hand size and arm length and all that
yeah,
kind of stuff. What specifically do
that's
you
right.
think that the Bengals might value the most, in terms of like buzzwords that people can get in their brains when they're going and they're looking at some of these offensive tackles, that would be more concerning or less concerning for the Bengals if they're trying to evaluate this position group?
I think it'll be
Mhm.
offensive line. I think it'll be size. They want mass. Think about Orlando Brown. He's already at left tackle. This guy's what, 6'7", 340 pounds. Trent Brown is 6'8", 350 plus pounds. These guys are massive. Right now, getting off the bus, the Cincinnati Bengals offensive line is looking really good. I mean, the guards are big and strong. They are huge. And so to be able to add another younger player, considering the veteran years that are right now on Trent Brown and Orlando Brown, you expect them to be able to stay healthy. But I think having some depth and having another player within the rotation, I think would be really good. And Lens, also don't sleep if one of those corners, one of the top corners on the board, like Terrion Arnold, if he's still there, I don't think they would blink or hesitate to be able to take him. I think another player, kind of to the liking of one Lou Anaromo, is Cooper
Mm.
DeJean from the University of Iowa, a guy who can play safety, he can play corner, he can play nickel. He's a hybrid player who does so many things well. We always say that the defensive backs are the decathletes of the NFL, where Cooper DeJean is a decathlete, a heck of a baseball player, multi-skilled football player who's played a lot of different positions on the football field, and from the neck up has a tremendously high football IQ. The Cincinnati Bengals, they love top-notch corners. So if one of the top three or four are still there, I think they're going to find it hard to pass on that
What
player as
about the
well.
later rounds? Is there anything specific that you would like them to attack at some point in terms of a position group?
I was going to say tight end, but if it's not Brock Bowers, it
Uh,
doesn't matter. I mean, seriously, like with the wide receiver position, Lance, it's about supply and
mhm.
demand, right? There's a huge demand for elite wide
Yeah.
receivers, but the reason why you can wait till later because there's a huge supply
Yeah.
as well, right? Now, but think about this: you don't find a Travis Kelsey in a draft every single year. A Sam Laporta, right? You might the last couple of years we've been really good with the tight ends this year, but Brock Bowers is such above a lot of the players that we see coming in the draft every single year that his grade is so much beyond an average or typical, even a first round tight end. He even exceeds that in terms of his production, his versatility, his speed, his strength. And so that's why once you're past him, the next tight end on the board is not even in the same zip code. And that's
Yeah.
why if you missed out on him, you're not trying to stick around wait for the next tight end. So look, they have a really good roster, and that's why they can allow the board to come to them. So after maybe the defensive tackle or the offensive tackle or the cornerback, when they get into those later rounds, if they don't get them in the first round, they'll still be looking for them a little bit later in the draft
Yeah,
as
I
well.
wouldn't be surprised if they just for depth purposes took a running back at some point later. And again, this is later that we're talking about with Joe
Yeah,
Mixon now in
yeah,
Houston. I really love the Zach Moss
hmm
signing. I told you I do the
yeah,
fantasy football
yeah,
show
yeah.
for the Believe Network, and from a fantasy
Mhm,
standpoint, I think there's massive value in Zach Moss. So I love that pick. But obviously, you can always have depth at the running back position, and this isn't a high end running
mhm,
back group, so that's where you're looking at running backs anyway. That's the Bengals. 9-8 last year without a healthy Burrow for a good chunk of the season. Be sure to tune into the Believe in Bengals podcast for more on them and their draft approach. Some great recent guests that you've had on, Solly, like Trevor Sikkema, Anthony Munoz, Luke Easterling. So be sure to check that out, everybody.